That afternoon, back at the plantation, Isaiah gathered the family in the parlor. He announced his plans to expand the breeding program in the coming year. He explained his expectations for each family member. He emphasized the importance of productivity, of maximizing returns, of ensuring the plantation's prosperity. His tone was businesslike, as if he were discussing crop rotation or equipment maintenance. The children listened. Even Samuel, despite his drinking, nodded acceptance. This was their normal. This was what they had been taught their entire lives. But something was shifting. The slaves in the quarters had begun quietly organizing. A man named Josiah, who was 26 years old and had been born on the plantation, had been making contact with enslaved people on neighboring plantations during Sunday church services when plantation slaves were sometimes permitted to attend. He gathered information about possible escape routes, about sympathetic whites who might help, about the tensions brewing between North and South that might present opportunities. He shared this information carefully, only with people he trusted completely, knowing that one informant could destroy everyone. The stage was set for confrontation. The Jessup family believed they were in complete control, that their system was functioning smoothly, that they could continue indefinitely. The enslaved people knew otherwise. They understood that change was coming, whether through escape or through the political upheaval that everyone could sense approaching. The question was not whether the system would end, but how, and how much blood would be spilled in its ending. The events of 1859 shattered the careful structure Isaiah Jessup had built. The collapse began not with external intervention but from within the enslaved community itself. Driven by desperation and rage that had built for more than a decade. On a February night, when the moon was barely a sliver in the sky, 3 enslaved women, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia, made their attempt. Hannah was the woman Thomas had first been paired with 11 years earlier. She had borne 5 children, all taken from her. Rachel had been Samuel's first, mother of 4. Julia had borne 3 children fathered by Daniel. All 3 women were in their late 20s or early 30s. All 3 had reached a point where death seemed preferable to continuing their existence on the Jessup plantation. They left separately to avoid suspicion, planning to meet 2 millas north at a creek crossing they had scouted during previous Sunday walks to the neighboring plantation's church services. The plan was to follow the creek north, travel only at night, head toward Tennessee, and then possibly further north. Hosea had provided them with the little information he had gathered about routes and contacts. They made it 6 millas before being discovered missing at morning roll call. Isaiah immediately sent Thomas and Daniel with 2 trusted enslaved trackers and dogs to hunt them down. The dogs picked up the scent quickly. The women were found hiding in a ravine by early afternoon. They had no weapons, no real chance of escape. They were brought back to the plantation in chains. Isaiah ordered a public punishment. Every enslaved person on the plantation was required to watch. The 3 women were whipped, 10 lashes each, tied to posts in the yard between the main house and the quarters. Ruth watched from the porch. The children watched from windows. The screams carried across the fields. After the whipping, Isaiah made a speech. He stood before the assembled enslaved people and explained that the women had been ungrateful, had rejected the good treatment they received on his plantation, had attempted theft, for they were stealing themselves, which was theft of his property. He warned that any future escape attempts would be punished more severely. He reminded them that they were fortunate to be on the Jessup plantation rather than somewhere with harsher conditions. The speech was met with silence. The enslaved people stood motionless, faces carefully blank, revealing nothing. But inside, the hatred intensified. Hannah, Rachel, and Julia were locked in a small storage building for 3 days with minimal food and water, then returned to work. Hannah could barely walk for weeks due to infection in the whipping wounds. Rachel developed a fever that lasted for days. Julia survived physically, but something had broken in her mentally. She worked mechanically, responded when spoken to, but the light had gone from her eyes. Samuel Jessup witnessed the whipping from his bedroom window. He was drunk, as he was nearly every afternoon by that point. The sight of the women being punished, women he had been forced to rape repeatedly by his father's system, triggered something. That evening, he confronted Isaiah in the study. The argument was loud enough to be heard throughout the house. Samuel accused his father of cruelty, of creating a system of horror, of destroying everyone it touched, including his own children. Isaiah responded with cold fury. He told Samuel he was weak, ungrateful, a disappointment. He told him that if he could not fulfill his duties as a son, he would be cut off from the family entirely. Samuel shouted that he would rather be cut off than continue participating in the breeding program. Isaiah struck him. The blow knocked Samuel to the floor. Isaiah stood over his son and told him that he would continue his duties or leave the plantation immediately with nothing. Samuel left. He walked out of the house that night, took a horse from the barn, and rode toward Natchez. He never returned to the Jessup plantation. Samuel's departure shocked the family. Ruth wept, more from embarrassment than grief. Thomas increased his work to compensate for Samuel's absence. Margaret retreated further into silence. Daniel and Elizabeth seemed unaffected, continuing their roles in the system without comment. Isaiah refused to speak of Samuel, forbidding anyone from mentioning his name. But Samuel's confrontation had exposed the reality they all knew but never acknowledged. The system was built on violence, on the destruction of human souls, and it was destroying the Jessup family as surely as it destroyed the enslaved people they brutalized. Spring brought more trouble. Several enslaved children fell ill with measles, an outbreak that spread quickly through the crowded quarters. 2 children died. One of them was a 4-year-old girl named Clara, who had been fathered by Thomas. It was the first time one of the children directly descended from the family had died on the plantation. Isaiah noted the death in his ledger as a financial loss. Thomas said nothing publicly, but he attended the child's burial in the slave cemetery, standing at a distance, watching as the small body was lowered into the ground. Margaret became pregnant again in April. This was her 6th pregnancy. And her psychological state had deteriorated so severely that Ruth began to worry she might not survive childbirth. Margaret barely ate, spent hours staring out her bedroom window, flinched when anyone approached her. Ruth tried various tonics and treatments, but nothing helped. Margaret was trapped in a nightmare of her parents' creation, and there was no escape. In May, Josiah and 4 other enslaved men made their escape attempt. They were better prepared than the women had been. They had gathered supplies secretly over months: food, tools, a stolen knife. They left on a Saturday night when the white family was asleep and made it almost 20 millas before being discovered missing on Sunday morning. Isaiah sent Thomas and Daniel with a larger party to search. This time, the search took 3 days. Josiah's group had split up, making tracking harder. Eventually, all 5 were captured separately and brought back. The punishment was brutal. Isaiah had them whipped severely, 20 lashes each. Hosea, as the leader, received 30. Then Isaiah did something he had never done before. He sold all 5 men immediately to a slave trader who transported them to Louisiana sugar plantations, where working conditions were notoriously harsh and life expectancy was short. He wanted to send a message that escape attempts would result not just in punishment but in exile to worse situations. The sale of Josiah and the others devastated the enslaved community. Hosea had been a leader, someone people looked to for hope. His removal left a void. But it also confirmed what everyone already knew. There was no mercy on the Jessup plantation. No recognition of their humanity, no limit to the suffering that would be inflicted to maintain the system. Margaret went into labor in late July. The birth was difficult and prolonged. Ruth attended her along with an enslaved midwife named Bella, who had delivered dozens of babies on the plantation. Margaret screamed for hours. The baby, when it finally came, was a boy. Margaret held him for perhaps 30 seconds before losing consciousness. She did not wake up. She died 2 hours later from blood loss and complications. Margaret's death struck the family in ways that previous suffering had not. She was one of their own, a white woman, a daughter. Her death could not be dismissed or rationalized away. Ruth collapsed in grief. Thomas and Daniel stood in shocked silence. Elizabeth locked herself in her room. Isaiah retreated to his study. The funeral was held 3 days later. Margaret was buried in the family cemetery on the plantation, marked with a proper stone. The Presbyterian minister gave a eulogy about God's mysterious ways and the consolation of faith. Neighboring plantation families attended and offered condolences. No one mentioned the circumstances of Margaret's pregnancy or the system that had contributed to her death. Used when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Wilkinson County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The baby Margaret had died delivering survived. Isaiah named him Matthew and had him sent to the quarters to be raised by Claudia along with all the other children born from the breeding program. The boy's existence was a reminder of Margaret's death, and the family wanted him out of sight. After Margaret's funeral, something shifted in Ruth. She had been an active participant in the breeding program, had supervised pregnancies, had enforced her husband's rules without visible guilt. But her daughter's death broke through the psychological barriers she had constructed. She began to question quietly whether what they had done was worth the cost. She did not express this to Isaiah. He would have dismissed it as grief-induced weakness, but she confided in Elizabeth that she wondered if God was punishing them. Elizabeth, the youngest daughter, did not share her mother's doubts. At 20 years old, she was the most thoroughly indoctrinated of all the Jessup children. She had never known a world different from the one her parents created. Margaret's death saddened her, but she did not connect it to the breeding program. To Elizabeth, it was simply the danger of childbirth that all women faced. She continued her participation without hesitation, becoming pregnant again in September of 1859. Thomas, now 28 years old and effectively managing the plantation in his father's stead as Isaiah grew older and more withdrawn, began to recognize the unsustainability of the system. Not from moral awakening, Thomas had been too thoroughly shaped by his upbringing for that, but from practical observation. The enslaved population was growing increasingly hostile. Productivity in the fields had declined. The atmosphere of resentment and fear was palpable. The cotton yields were not matching the increased labor force. Something had to change. But Thomas had no idea what form that change should take. The autumn of 1859 brought news from the outside world that would eventually end the Jessup breeding program, though they did not know it yet. In October, a man named John Brown led a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, attempting to start a slave rebellion. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But the incident sent shockwaves through the South. Plantation owners everywhere tightened security, increased patrols, and viewed their enslaved people with heightened suspicion. Isaiah responded by implementing stricter controls on the Jessup plantation. No enslaved person could leave the property for any reason, even the supervised church visits on Sundays. Evening curfew was moved earlier. The number of white overseers was increased from 2 to 4, men hired from town to patrol the quarters and fields. Armed with rifles and whips, the plantation began to feel like a prison, which in truth it had always been. But now the bars were visible and the guards were everywhere. The increased security made life even more unbearable for the enslaved people. They could not gather in groups larger than 5 without an overseer demanding to know what they were discussing. Their cabins were searched randomly for any contraband, tools that might be used as weapons, food that might be stored for escape attempts, anything that suggested independent thought or planning. Punishments for minor infractions became more severe. A man named Robert was whipped for talking back to an overseer. A woman named Dana was locked in the storage shed for those days for being late to field work. The pressure was building toward an explosion. And in December of 1859, it came. On the night of December 18th, a Sunday, when the white family was asleep, and the overseers were making their rounds at the far end of the property, fire broke out in the cotton gin building. The flames spread quickly, fed by stored cotton and dried wood. By the time anyone noticed, the entire structure was engulfed. The alarm was raised. Everyone, White family, overseers, enslaved people, rushed to fight the fire, forming bucket lines from the well, desperately trying to prevent the flames from spreading to other buildings. They saved the main house and the barn, but the cotton gin burned to the ground along with a significant portion of the stored cotton waiting to be processed. The financial loss was devastating. But more significant was what Isaiah found the next morning when he inspected the ruins, evidence that the fire had been deliberately set, remnants of oil-soaked rags placed strategically to maximize damage. Isaiah immediately ordered an investigation. He gathered all the enslaved people and demanded to know who had set the fire. No one spoke. He threatened mass punishment. Silence. He had the overseers search the quarters, looking for any evidence, any indication of guilt. Nothing was found. Frustrated and enraged, Isaiah selected 3 men at random, Peter, Moses, and James, and had them whipped as an example, 20 lashes each, in front of the assembled enslaved population. He told everyone that until someone confessed, random punishments would continue. It would destroy them all if necessary to find the guilty party. But no one confessed because everyone was guilty. The fire had been set by a group of 7 people working together, carefully chosen for their trustworthiness and their shared determination. They had planned it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. The fire was not meant to kill anyone. It was set at night when the building was empty, but to strike at Isaiah's wealth, to cost him money, to demonstrate that they were not completely powerless. The fire marked a turning point. The enslaved community had moved from passive resistance and escape attempts to active sabotage. They understood that they could hurt their oppressor even if they could not free themselves. Over the following months, other incidents occurred. Tools went missing. A fence critical for containing livestock was damaged, allowing pigs to escape. A supply of seed corn stored for spring planting was found contaminated with dirt. Isaiah responded with increasingly harsh measures, but each punishment only deepened the resentment and determination. The plantation had become a war zone, though the war was largely invisible to outside observers. To neighboring plantation owners, the Jessup property still appeared prosperous and well-managed. They noticed the burned cotton gin, but fires were not uncommon on plantations. They had no idea of the seething conflict beneath the surface. Thomas tried to counsel his father toward moderation, not from compassion, but from pragmatism. The harsh punishments were making the enslaved people less productive, more dangerous. But Isaiah would not hear it. He had spent 24 years building his system, and he would not abandon it now. The breeding program would continue. Control would be maintained. His will would prevail. Ruth, meanwhile, had retreated almost entirely from active participation in plantation management. Margaret's death had broken something in her that would not heal. She spent her days in her room reading scripture, praying, writing letters to her sister in South Carolina that revealed a mind slowly fragmenting under the weight of guilt she could no longer suppress. In one letter from January 1860, she wrote, "I fear we have sinned greatly and God's judgment approaches. My daughter is dead. My son is lost to drink and exile. And I wake each night hearing screams that may be real or may be echoes of all the years past." Elizabeth gave birth to her second child in February 1860. A girl, like Margaret before her. Elizabeth was immediately expected to resume her participation in the breeding program. Unlike Margaret, Elizabeth showed no signs of psychological distress. She had been too young when the program began, had absorbed her parents' worldview too completely to develop the moral conflict that had destroyed her sister and brother. Elizabeth was, in some ways, the program's greatest success and its most horrifying product, a person so thoroughly indoctrinated that she felt no guilt for participating in systemic rape and enslavement. As winter turned to spring in 1860, political tensions between North and South reached a breaking point. Abraham Lincoln's presidential campaign, with its platform opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories, was seen by many Southerners as an existential threat. Plantation owners throughout Mississippi began discussing secession, preparing for possible conflict. Isaiah attended meetings in Woodville, where local leaders debated their response to Northern aggression, as they termed it. Isaiah was consumed with defending slavery in the abstract, the Southern way of life, states, rights, property rights, while being blind to the specific horrors he had created on his own plantation. It could give passionate speeches about the biblical justification for slavery, about the economic necessity of the institution, about the supposed happiness of enslaved people under benevolent masters, while forcing his own children to rape women he owned and separating mothers from babies. The cognitive dissonance never seemed to register. In noviembre de 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December. Mississippi followed in January 1861. By February, 7 southern states had formed the Confederate States of America. What was coming, though few people in early 1861 believed it would last long or cost much blood. The prevailing opinion in Mississippi was that the North would back down, that Southerners' superior military tradition would ensure quick victory, that the world would not allow the cotton supply to be disrupted. The Jessup Plantation continued its operations through these political upheavals, but the approaching war created uncertainty. Thomas and Daniel were of military age and would likely be expected to fight. The plantation's workforce might be reduced if enslaved men were impressed into service building fortifications or working for the Confederate Army. The breeding program, which had been the focus of family efforts for more than 2 decades, suddenly seemed less important than survival in a changing world. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War began. Thomas enlisted in a Mississippi regiment within weeks. Daniel followed in May. Isaiah, at 63 years old, was too old for military service. He remained on the plantation with Ruth, Elizabeth, the hired overseers, and the enslaved population of 73 people, a population that included dozens of children fathered by the Jessup men. With Thomas and Daniel gone, the day-to-day management of the plantation fell to Isaiah and the overseers. The breeding program continued, but with less intensity and organization. Isaiah was aging, increasingly plagued by health problems. Ruth was barely functional, spending most of her time in her room. Elizabeth managed the household but had neither the authority nor the inclination to oversee field operations. The war years were chaotic. The Union blockade of southern ports made it difficult to sell cotton. Confederate currency became increasingly worthless. Food supplies were diverted to feed the army. The plantation began to decline. Buildings needed repairs that were not made. Fields were planted and harvested, but the work was done with less supervision and increasing resentment. The enslaved people on the Jessup plantation heard rumors of Union advances, of enslaved people escaping to Union lines and gaining freedom, of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Hope began to replace despair. They understood that the world was changing, that the system that had held them in bondage was collapsing. They waited. Thomas Jessup was killed at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Daniel died of dysentery in a military camp in Virginia in 1863. Both deaths devastated Isaiah. His sons, whom he had raised to inherit and continue his plantation empire, were gone. His dream of a multi-generational dynasty built on the breeding program died with them. Ruth died in her sleep in August 1864. The doctor said it was heart failure, but it might more accurately have been described as the final collapse of a woman who had lived too long with guilt she could acknowledge but not escape. She was buried next to Margaret in the family cemetery. By early 1865, the Jessup plantation was a shadow of what it had been. Isaiah was 67 years old, in failing health, increasingly confused. Elizabeth, now 26, managed what she could, but the situation was beyond her control. The enslaved people were barely working, waiting for the Union Army that everyone knew was coming. The overseers had left, either to join the army or to flee north. The plantation buildings were deteriorating. The fields were partially planted but poorly tended. In April 1865, news reached Wilkinson County that the Confederate Army had surrendered. The war was over. Slavery was ended. The world the Jessups had built and defended was gone. Union troops arrived in Woodville and an officer came to the Jessup plantation to inform Isaiah and Elizabeth that the enslaved people were now free. Isaiah, weakened by stroke and confined to a wheelchair, could barely comprehend what he was being told. Elizabeth understood but refused to accept it. She argued with the officer, insisted that the people on the plantation were her property, demanded compensation for the loss. The officer explained that there would be no compensation, that slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment, that she needed to accept reality. The formerly enslaved people of the Jessup plantation gathered their belongings and left. Some went immediately, walking away the same day they learned of their freedom. Others stayed for weeks, uncertain where to go or how to survive in a world they had never known as free people. By July, only a handful remained, mostly elderly people who had nowhere else to go. Hannah, the first woman forced into the breeding program, left with her surviving children. She walked north, eventually reaching Memphis, Tennessee, where she found work as a washerwoman and lived until 1889. Rachel went west toward Vicksburg with her children. Julia, who had never recovered psychologically from the trauma of her years on the plantation, stayed for several months, unable to make the decision to leave until other freed people finally convinced her to come with them to a Freedmen's Bureau camp where she might receive help. The children fathered by the Jessup men, those who survived to see freedom, scattered. Most took names different from Jessup, wanting no association with their father's family. Some became farmers, working their own land. Some moved to cities. A few managed to get an education and became teachers or ministers. They carried the trauma of their origins throughout their lives, but they were free. Isaiah Jessup died in October 1865. The cause was listed as complications from a stroke. But more fundamentally, he died because the world he understood had ended and he could not adapt. He was buried in the family cemetery next to Ruth and Margaret. No one mourned except Elizabeth. Elizabeth tried to maintain the plantation after her father's death, but it was impossible. She had no workforce, no money, no credit. The cotton gin had never been rebuilt after the fire. The buildings continued to deteriorate. In 1867, she sold the property for a fraction of its former value to a northern investor who planned to divide it into smaller farms to be worked by free labor. Elizabeth used the money to move to Mobile, Alabama, where she lived with distant relatives. She never married, never spoke publicly about the plantation or her family, and died in 1891 at age 52. Samuel Jessup, the son who had fled the plantation in 1859, survived the war years, working various jobs in Natchez and New Orleans under an assumed name. He never stopped drinking. He died of liver failure in 1872, estranged from his remaining family, leaving no heirs and few possessions. His death went largely unnoticed. The Jessup plantation itself was divided into 4 separate farms by 1870. The main house, stripped of its furnishings and left abandoned, slowly collapsed over the following decades. By 1900, nothing remained but the foundation stones and a few outbuildings. The slave quarters rotted and fell. The family cemetery, overgrown and neglected, became difficult to find. The cotton gin side was plowed under and planted with crops. The children born from the breeding program and their descendants spread throughout the South and eventually across the country. Most never knew the full story of their origins. The trauma was too great to speak of, and the surviving mothers who had endured the program rarely told their children the details of their conception. The secret was buried with each generation. The Jessup ledgers, which documented the breeding program in meticulous detail, survived by accident. They were stored in a locked trunk that ended up in the possession of a descendant of Ruth's sister in South Carolina. That descendant, cleaning out an attic in 1962, discovered the trunk and the ledgers inside. Shocked by what they revealed, the descendant donated them to a university archive where they became available to historians researching the realities of slavery. 12 ledgers, along with scattered letters, county records, and the oral histories eventually collected from descendants of enslaved people who survived the Jessup plantation, provide the evidence for what occurred between 1835 and 1865. The story is documented, verifiable, and profoundly disturbing. The Jessup case was not unique. Historical research has revealed numerous instances of plantation owners forcing enslaved women into sexual relationships, of systematic breeding programs designed to increase enslaved populations, of families participating in these practices across generations. What makes the Jessup case notable is the documentation, the cold, detailed records that Isaiah kept, treating human reproduction as livestock management. The psychological impact on everyone involved was devastating. The enslaved women who were raped repeatedly, who bore children they were not allowed to raise, who lived in constant fear and degradation, suffered trauma that affected them for the rest of their lives and was passed down to their children. The Jessup children, raised in a system of systemic abuse, were themselves damaged beyond repair. Thomas and Daniel died young in a war defending the system that had poisoned their souls. Samuel drank himself to death, trying to escape his guilt. Margaret died giving birth to her sixth child from the breeding program. Elizabeth lived longer but never found peace or happiness. Ruth and Isaiah, the architects of the system, lived long enough to see it collapse, but never acknowledged the evil they had created. They died believing they had been good Christians, responsible plantation owners, victims of northern aggression and economic forces beyond their control. They never accepted moral responsibility for the suffering they caused. The most chilling aspect of the Jessup case is how normal they appeared to their contemporaries. Church members who knew them for decades described Isaiah as a devoted family man, and Ruth as a pious woman who read scripture daily. Business associates considered Isaiah honest in his dealings, prompt in paying debts, reliable in his contracts. Neighbors saw the Jessup family as pillars of their community. No one intervened because no one believed intervention was necessary. The horror was hidden in plain sight, protected by the legal framework of slavery and the social conventions that prevented questions about what happened on a man's property. The enslaved people who survived the Jessup plantation carried their trauma silently for years after emancipation. In the 1930s, when the Federal Writers Project conducted interviews with formerly enslaved people as part of documenting American history, several individuals who had lived on the Jessup plantation were interviewed. Their testimonies, recorded in aged voices but with vivid memories, confirmed the breeding program's existence. An elderly woman named Patience, who had been born on the plantation in 1854, told her interviewer, Mr. Jessup, he run that place like he was God himself. He decided who born, who live, who sold away. His own children did what he said. Every one of them. We wasn't people to them. We was crops they was growing. These oral histories, preserved in Library of Congress archives, corroborate the documentary evidence found in the ledgers. What happened on the Jessup plantation between 1835 and 1865 was legal under the laws of Mississippi and the Confederate States. That is perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. Isaiah Jessup was never charged with a crime, never investigated by authorities, never held accountable in any legal sense. The system of slavery gave him absolute power over the people he owned. And he used that power to create a nightmare that lasted 3 decades. His family participated willingly, shaped by their upbringing into believing that their actions were not just permissible, but admirable, a demonstration of business acumen and family loyalty. The Jessup breeding program was slavery operating exactly as the system was designed to operate, reducing human beings to property, stripping them of agency, exploiting them for profit, and destroying them without consequence. The children born from the breeding program numbered at least 47 according to Isaiah's ledgers, though the actual number may have been higher as some births likely went unrecorded, particularly those that resulted in infant deaths. Of those 47 documented children, approximately 30 survived to see emancipation. Their descendants today number in the hundreds, spread across the United States, most unaware of their connection to the Jessup plantation or the circumstances of their ancestors' births. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed genetic links between individuals descended from the enslaved population and individuals descended from the Jessup family, providing scientific verification of what the historical records already documented. Some descendants have sought each other out, creating connections across racial lines born from shared trauma. Others prefer not to know, finding the truth too painful to confront.